Learn English through story. The story of a wonderful girl. My name is Jane Eyre, and my story begins when I was 10. I was living with my aunt, Mrs. Reed, because my mother and father were both dead. Mrs. Reed was rich. Her house was large and beautiful, but I was not happy there. Mrs. Reed had 3 children: Eliza, John, and Georgiana. My cousins were older than I. They never wanted to play with me, and they were often unkind. I was afraid of them. I was most afraid of my cousin John. He enjoyed frightening me and making me feel unhappy. One afternoon, I hid from him in a small room. I had a book with a lot of pictures in it, and I felt quite happy. John and his sisters were with their mother. But then John decided to look for me.
"Where's Jane Eyre?"
He shouted.
"Jane, Jane, come out!"
He could not find me at first. He was not quick or clever. But then Eliza, who was clever, found my hiding place.
"Here she is!"
She shouted. I had to come out. And John was waiting for me. "What do you want?" I asked him.
"I want you to come here."
John said. I went and stood in front of him. He looked at me for a long time and then, suddenly he hit me.
"Now, go and stand near the door,"
He said. I was very frightened. I knew that John wanted to hurt me. I went and stood near the door. Then, John picked up a large, heavy book and threw it straight at me. The book hit me on the head, and I fell.
"You cruel boy!"
I shouted.
You always want to hurt me.
"Look!"
I touched my head. There was blood on it. John became angrier. He ran across the room and started to hit me. Again and again. I was hurt and afraid, so I hit him back. Mrs. Reed heard the noise and hurried into the room. She was very angry. She did not seem to notice the blood on my head.
"Jane Eyre, you bad girl!"
She shouted.
"Why are you hitting your poor cousin? Take her away. Take her to the red room and lock the door."
The red room was cold and dark. I was very frightened. Nobody ever went into the red room at night. I cried to help, but nobody came. "Please help me," I called. "Don't leave me here." But nobody came to open the door. I cried for a long time, and then everything suddenly went black. I remember nothing after that. When at last I woke up, I was in my bed. My head was hurting. The doctor was there.
What happened?
I asked him.
You are ill, Jane.
The doctor answered.
Tell me, Jane. Are you unhappy here with your aunt and your cousins?
Yes, I am. I'm very unhappy,
I see.
said the doctor.
Would you like to go away to school?
He asked. Oh, yes, I think so. I told him. The doctor looked at me again, and then he left the room. He talked to Mrs. Reed for a long time. They decided to send me away to school. So not long afterwards, I left my aunt's house to go to school. Mrs. Reed and my cousins were pleased when I went away. I was not really sad to leave. Perhaps I'll be happy at school, I thought. Perhaps I'll have some friends there. One night in January, after a long journey, I arrived at Lowood School. It was dark and the weather was cold, windy and rainy. The school was very large, but it was not warm and comfortable, like Mrs. Reed's house. A teacher took me into a big room. It was full of girls. There were about 80 girls there. The youngest girls were 9, and the eldest were about 20. They all wore ugly brown dresses. It was supper time. There was water to drink and a small piece of bread to eat. I was thirsty and drank some water. I could not eat anything because I felt too tired and too excited. After supper, all the girls went upstairs to bed. The teacher took me into a very long room. All the girls slept in this room. 2 girls had to sleep in each bed. Early in the morning, I woke up. It was still dark outside, and the room was very cold. The girls washed themselves in cold water and put on their brown dresses. Then everybody went downstairs, and the early morning lessons began. At last, it was time for breakfast. I was now very hungry. We went into the dining room with the teachers. There was a terrible smell of burning food. We were all hungry, but when we tasted the food, we could not eat it. It tasted terrible. Feeling very hungry, we all left the dining room. At 9 o'clock, lessons began again. I looked round at the other girls. They looked very strange in their ugly brown dresses. I did not like the teachers. They seemed to be unkind and unfriendly. Then, at 12 o'clock, the head teacher, Miss Temple, came in. She was very pretty, and her face was kind.
I want to speak to all the girls.
She said.
I know that you could not cut your breakfast this morning.
She told us.
So now, you will have some bread and cheese and a cup of coffee.
The other teachers looked surprised.
I'll pay for this meal.
Miss Temple said. The girls were very pleased. After this meal, we went out the garden. The girls' brown dresses were too thin for the cold winter weather. Most of the girls looked cold and unhappy, and some of them looked very ill. I walked around and looked at the girls, at the school and the garden. But I did not speak to anyone, and nobody spoke to me. One of the girls was reading a book. "Is your book interesting?" I asked her.
I like it.
She answered. "Does this school belong to Miss Temple?" I asked.
No, it doesn't.
She answered.
It belongs to Mr. Brocklehurst. He buys all our food and all our clothes.
The girl's name was Helen Burns. She was older than I was. I liked her immediately. She became my friend. Helen told me that many of the girls were ill because they were always cold and hungry. Mr. Brocklehurst was not a kind man. The clothes he bought for the girls were not warm enough for the winter, and there was never enough food to eat. After a few months, many of the girls at Lowood School became seriously ill. Lessons stopped, and I and the other girls, who were not ill, spent all our time out in the fields near the school. The weather was now warm and sunny. It was a happy time for us, but my friend Helen Burns was not with us. She had to stay in bed. She was very ill. One evening, I went to Miss Temple's room. Helen Burns was lying there in a little bed. She was now very thin, and her face was white. She spoke to me in a low voice.
"Jane, it's good to see you. I want to say goodbye to you."
Why?
Are you going away?
I asked her.
"Yes, I am."
Helen answered.
I'm going far away.
That night she died. During that summer, many other girls in the school died too. Mr. Brocklehurst sold the school, and it became a happier place. I stayed at the school until I was 18. And then, I had to find a job. I want to become a teacher. I wrote a letter to a newspaper. I said I was a young teacher who wanted a job working in a family. Then, I waited for an answer. At last, an answer came. It was from a lady, Mrs. Fairfax, who lived at a place called Thornfield Hall. She needed a teacher for a little girl. So, I packed my clothes in a small bag and traveled to Thornfield Hall. I felt very excited when I arrived at Thornfield Hall. The house was large, but it seemed very quiet.
Mrs. Fairfax met me at the door. She was an old lady with a kind face.
"Sit down, Miss Eyre,"
she said.
"You look tired after your journey. Later, you will meet Adele."
Is Adele my student?
"Yes, she is. She is French. Mr. Rochester wants you to teach her English."
Who is Mr. Rochester? I asked. Mrs. Fairfax looked surprised.
"Did you not know? Thornfield Hall belongs to Mr. Rochester."
She answered.
"I only work for him."
Is Mr. Rochester here now?
I asked.
No, he is away. He does not come very often to Thornfield. I do not know when he will return.
Later, I met Adele. She was a pretty little girl. I spoke to her in French and began to teach her English. She enjoyed her lessons, and I enjoyed teaching her. I like Adele, and I like Mrs. Fairfax, too. It was quiet at Thornfield Hall, and sometimes I felt a little bored, but everybody was kind to me there. One afternoon, I walked to the village to post a letter. It was winter, and there was ice on the road. As I was walking back to Thornfield Hall, I heard a noise behind me. It was a horse. A man was riding towards Thornfield Hall. I stood on one side, and the horse went past. The man did not see me. He was a stranger with dark hair. Suddenly, with a loud noise, the stranger's horse fell down on the ice. The man was lying on the ground, trying to get up. I ran forward to help. "Are you hurt, sir?" I asked him. The stranger looked surprised to see me.
"A little,"
he answered.
"Could you help me to catch my horse?" "That's right. Now, could you bring the horse here, please? Thank you."
The stranger tried to stand up, but his leg was hurting too much. He looked at me again.
"Could you help me to get up on its back again?" "Good, thank you, miss."
I watched him as he rode away. Who is he? I asked myself. He is not handsome, but he has an interesting face. I would like to know him. When I got back to Thornfield, everybody was very excited. Mrs. Fairfax was very busy.
What's happening?
I asked her.
Oh, Miss Eyre,
Said Mrs. Fairfax.
it is Mr. Rochester. He has suddenly come back, but he will probably go away again soon. Now, Miss Eyre, you must go and put on your best dress. Mr. Rochester wants to meet you and Adele after dinner.
Later that evening, I took Adele to Mr. Rochester's room. I felt rather afraid of meeting Mr. Rochester. I went quietly into the room and saw a man there. I knew him. It was the man on the horse. So, the interesting stranger was Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester did not go away again. He was busy every day, but sometimes in the evenings, he talked to me. He was usually serious, and he did not smile or laugh very often, but he was interesting, and I was not afraid of him. I began to enjoy myself more at Thornfield Hall. One night, I woke up suddenly. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. I thought I heard a sound. Everything was very quiet. I listened carefully, and the sound came again. Someone was walking about outside my room.
Who's there?
I called. Nobody answered. I felt cold and frightened. The house was silent. I tried to sleep again. Then I heard a laugh. It was a terrible, cruel laugh. I listened. Someone was walking away, going up the stairs to the attic.
What was happening?
I decided to go and find Mrs. Fairfax. I put on some clothes and left my room.
The house was quiet now, but suddenly I could smell smoke. Something was burning. I ran to find out. The smoke was coming from Mr. Rochester's room. I ran into the room and looked around. Mr. Rochester was asleep in his bed, and the bed was on fire.
What can I do?
I thought. Quickly, I looked around the room. Luckily, there was some water in one corner. As quickly as I could, I took the water and threw it all over the bed. Mr. Rochester woke up.
What's happening?
He shouted.
Jane, is it you? What are you doing?
Mr. Rochester,
I said.
your bed is on fire. You must get up at once.
He jumped out of bed. There was water everywhere, and the fire was still smoking.
Jane, you've saved me from the fire. How did you know about it? Why did you wake up?
Mr. Rochester asked. I told him about the noise outside my door and the terrible laugh. Mr. Rochester looked serious and angry.
I must go upstairs to the attic. Stay here and wait for me. Please do not wake Mrs. Fairfax.
He left the room, and I waited for him. At last, he came back. He was still looking very serious.
You can go back to bed now, Jane. Everything is all right now.
A Wonderful Girl. Part 2.
Who lives in the attic?
I asked Mrs. Fairfax the next day.
Only Grace Poole.
She answered.
She's one of the servants. She is a strange woman.
I remembered Grace Poole. She was a strange, silent woman who did not often speak to other servants. So perhaps it was Grace Poole who walked around the house late at night and laughed strangely outside the doors. That evening, when Adele finished her lessons, I went downstairs. Mrs. Fairfax met me.
Mr. Rochester left the house early this morning.
She said.
He is going to stay with his friends. I think he will stay with them for some weeks. I do not know when he will come back.
For several weeks, the house was very quiet again. Mr. Rochester stayed with his friends, and I continued my lessons with Adele. I did not hear the strange and terrible laugh at night again. One day, Mrs. Fairfax showed me a letter from Mr. Rochester.
He is coming back,
she said.
And he is bringing a lot of visitors with him. I am going to be very busy getting everything ready. Miss Blanche Ingram is coming too. She's very beautiful.
Mr. Rochester and his friends arrived. The visitors were all rich, important people. Miss Blanche Ingram was among them. She was beautiful but very proud. Some of the visitors were nice to me, but the others did not notice me. I was too poor and unimportant. Miss Ingram never spoke to me. She was not interested in me, but she seemed to be interested in Mr. Rochester. She always seemed to enjoy her conversations with him. They often went out riding together.
I think Mr. Rochester will marry Miss Ingram,
said Mrs. Fairfax.
But was Mr. Rochester interested in Blanche Ingram? He seemed to like her, but he did not look very happy when they were together. One evening, a new visitor came to Thornfield Hall. He was a quiet young man with dark hair called Mr. Mason. He came to see Mr. Rochester on business. Mr. Mason told us that he and Mr. Rochester were old friends, but Mr. Rochester was not very pleased to see Mr. Mason. When Mr. Rochester heard the name, Mr. Mason, from the West Indies, he was surprised, and his face turned white. That night, Mr. Rochester and Mr. Mason talked for a long time. At last, very late at night, they went to bed. Soon, everyone in the house was asleep. Suddenly, I woke up. I heard a terrible scream from somewhere over my head. Then, everything was very quiet again. I listened carefully, and then, I heard a lot of noise from above my head. There seemed to be fighting in the room above. Then, there was another scream.
Help! Help!
Someone shouted. There was more fighting. Then a voice called out.
Rochester, come quickly. Help me.
A door opened, and I heard someone running up the stairs to the attic. I quickly put on some clothes and opened my door. Everybody in the house was awake now. The visitors were all standing outside their door.
What's happening?
Is there a fire?
What was that noise?
They asked. Mr. Rochester came down from the attic.
Please don't worry.
He told his friends.
Everything is all right.
But what's happening?
Somebody asked.
One of the servants had a bad dream and started to scream.
Mr. Rochester said.
But everything is all right now. Please go back to bed.
Slowly, all Mr. Rochester's visitors returned to their rooms. I too went back to my room, but I did not go back to bed. I sat and looked out of the window. The house was very quiet now. There were no sounds from the attic. Then, someone knocked on my door. I opened it. Mr. Rochester stood outside.
Jane, come with me, please.
He told me.
But, come quietly, follow me.
I followed Mr. Rochester up to the attic. He unlocked the door of a room, and we went inside.
Wait here.
Mr. Rochester told me. I stood next to the door. There was another door on the opposite side of the room. From behind this door, I could hear a terrible sound. It was like an angry animal. Mr. Rochester left me and went through this door. Once again, I heard that terrible, cruel laugh. Was Grace Poole behind the door? Mr. Rochester spoke to someone inside the room, and then came out and locked the door again.
Came here, Jane.
He told me quietly. I came further into the room. There was a large bed in the room. Mr. Mason was lying on the bed. His face was white, and his eyes were closed. There was a lot of blood on his shirt. He did not move. Is he dead? I asked.
No,
Answered Mr. Rochester.
he isn't badly hurt, but I must go and bring the doctor for him. Will you stay with him until I get back?
The man on the bed moved and tried to speak. Mr. Rochester turned to him.
Don't try to talk, Mason. Jane, do not speak to him, please. There must be no conversation between you.
Mr. Rochester hurried out of the room. I waited for him with the silent man on the bed. I was frightened. I knew that Grace Poole was in the next room. For a long time, I waited for Mr. Rochester to return. When will he come back? I asked myself. At last morning came, and Mr. Rochester returned with the doctor. While the doctor was looking after Mr. Mason, Mr. Rochester spoke to me.
Thank you for all your help, Jane. Mason is going to leave Thornfield Hall now. The doctor will take him away.
He told me. We helped Mr. Mason down the stairs and out of the house. It was still early, and the other people in the house were still asleep.
Take care of poor Mason,
said Mr. Rochester to the doctor.
Soon he will be able to go back home, to the West Indies.
Before he left, Mr. Mason said something very strange.
Look after her, Rochester.
He said.
Promise to look after her.
Mr. Rochester looked sad.
I promise. I will always look after her.
I started to go back to the house.
Don't go, Jane.
Said Mr. Rochester.
Come into the garden. Talk to me.
We went into the garden.
What a night,
he said.
Were you frightened, Jane?
Yes, I was frightened. Up there, in the next room, there was someone, that terrible laugh. Mr. Rochester, will Grace Poole go away now?
No,
he replied.
But don't worry about Grace Poole. Try to forget about her. She isn't dangerous. It is Mason I am worrying about.
I was surprised to hear this. Mr. Mason? But he is frightened. He can't hurt you. Mr. Rochester looked sad.
I know Mason does not want to hurt me, but he could say something that will hurt me. I shall be happier when he goes back to the West Indies.
Later that day, I got a surprising letter. Mrs. Reed, my aunt, was dying and she wanted to see me. It was a long journey to her home. When I got there, I heard that my cousin John was dead. Mrs. Reed was very ill. At first, she did not want to speak to me. Then, one day, when I was sitting by her bed, she showed me a letter. It was from my uncle, my father's brother, who lived in Madeira. This was the letter.
Dear Mrs. Reed, please help me. I want to find my brother's daughter, Jane Eyre. I am a rich man, and I have no children. I want Jane Eyre to come and live with me. Yours sincerely, John Eyre.
I read the letter and looked at the date on it. But, Mrs. Reed, I said, this is an old letter. You got it 3 years ago.
I know, but I never liked you, Jane Eyre. After I read the letter, I wrote to your uncle. I told him you were dead. I told him you died at Lowood School. Now, go away. Leave me.
Soon afterwards, Mrs. Reed died, and I returned to Thornfield Hall. It was summer, and the fields around Thornfield Hall were very quiet and beautiful. For me, it was the most beautiful place in the world. It was my home now. Adele will be pleased to see me, I thought. But what about Mr. Rochester? He is the person I most want to see, but does he want to see me? Perhaps by now he is already married to Blanche Ingram. If they are not already married, they will be married very soon. I felt sad when I thought about Mr. Rochester and Blanche Ingram. So, I must soon leave this beautiful place. I thought,
I can't stay here when Mr. Rochester is married. I will never see Thornfield Hall again. And worse than that, I will never see Mr. Rochester again.
As I came near the house, I met Mr. Rochester. When I saw that he looked pleased to see me, I felt happier. Adele and Mrs. Fairfax were happy to see me too.
The visitors have all left now,
said Mrs. Fairfax.
It is very quiet here. It is good to see you again.
Yes, this is my home. I thought, I've always been happy here. How can I leave it? I started to work, teaching Adele again. Everything was the same as before. Mr. Rochester still said nothing about getting married to Blanche Ingram. Then, one evening, he saw me in the garden.
Come and talk to me, Jane.
He said. I went towards him. Now, I thought, he's going to tell me that he is going to get married.
Are you happy here, Jane?
Yes, I am very happy.
And you like Adele and Mrs. Fairfax?
Very much.
You'll be sad to leave them.
I looked away. Now, he is going to tell me that I must leave because he is going to be married. I thought. I looked at him. Yes. I answered. I will be very sad to leave.
But you must leave, you know.
Mr. Rochester said.
Must I? Must I leave soon?
Yes, soon.
Then you are going to get married.
Yes, I am going to get married. Adele must go to school, and you must get a new job. I will find you one, far from here.
Far from here? I asked, but then I'll never see Thornfield Hall again, and I'll never see you again, Mr. Rochester.
Oh, when you are far from here, you'll soon forget me.
He said. No, I thought, you will forget me, perhaps, but I will never forget you. Never. I answered him, at last. And I started to cry. I could not speak. He watched me carefully. Then at last, he spoke again.
Perhaps you do not need to go.
He said.
Perhaps you can stay here when I am married.
Did Mr. Rochester think that I had no feelings? Did he not understand how I felt? Were my feelings so unimportant? I now felt angry.
No.
I told him.
I could never stay. I will not stay. Miss Ingram. Miss Ingram will be your wife. I know that I am not rich and beautiful like Miss Ingram. I am poor and unimportant. But I can still feel sadness. And if you marry Miss Ingram, I must leave here.
Mr. Rochester looked at me, and then he smiled.
I don't want you to go, Jane. And I am not going to marry Miss Ingram. Don't get excited. I want you to stay here. It's you I want to marry.
I could not believe him.
Now, you are laughing at me,
I said.
No, I am not.
He answered.
I want you to marry me, Jane. Will you marry me?
He looked at me so seriously that at last, I did believe him. Mr. Rochester wanted to marry me. He wanted me to be his wife.
Yes, I will marry you,
I answered.
I will make you happy, Jane.
He said.
No one will stop us.
He continued, with a strange, half-sad look. I could not understand that look, but I was too happy to be worried about it. It grew dark, the wind began to blow, and it started to rain, so we walked together back to the house.